Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Joined for the last podcast of the year today by Josh Blank. Not the last podcast of all time.
No.
But last of the year or of all podcasts. But the last version of this podcast for this year. I'm practicing being precise.
Yeah.
And I'm joined by Josh Blank, Research Director of the Texas Politics Project.
Hello, hello.
So we've gone round and round about things we could talk about here. We posted a bunch of new content at the blog site.
We've put some pressure on ourselves at this end of the year thing.
Right. A lot of things that had been sitting around unfinished on my desk mainly. We sort of have gotten out. We're 2 for 3 right now and maybe even get one more out. So we urge you to go to texaspolitics.utexas.edu. We've got a post on legislative turnover that has the fruit of a lot of kind of digging into stuff that Josh has done. And then we have a piece on negative partisanship, which we've been promising / threatening to finish up and release for a long time. And for those of you that follow Texas government politics, but even national politics, we went back and looked at some of our data on the approval level the approval or disapproval that Texans grant the two political parties, and constructed a view of how negative partisanship works along with definitions. And again, if you listen to this podcast, we've talked about this a bit, but now we kind of produce the data and there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. We may circle back to that later today, but I think we ought to kind of talk about in the spirit of a year-end roundup and thinking about, where we stand. I mean, this happens all the time, and some of it's just manufactured, let's get some lists in the can so nobody has to work the last week of the year.
I love a good listicle.
In the media, and this isn't quite that, but there's a reasonable impulse to that, particularly where we are in the political trajectory right now, to be thinking about what we've seen this year, what's coming up, and what in Texas will be, a very interesting election year. I think 2 big themes have jumped out at me in coverage of politics, and there's a million things going on right now, other things that could be picked. But one is at the national level, this, resurgence of a discussion about democracy in the United States being in danger, how well it's functioning. I think that there was a lot of stuff written during the Trump presidency about democracy being imperiled in the United States. We saw a little bit of a very, slight, I went into abeyance slightly, but then the January 6th insurrection has really, resurrected that discussion, but now given it a different kind of tilt.
Well, and I think the thing what's really brought it up, I think, in national discussions in the last few weeks is as we get to candidate filing deadlines for the primaries, both in Texas and elsewhere, what you're seeing is a lot more, I guess I'll just put it this way, for now. Potentially, let's say, candidates for offices that oversee elections in a lot of states and localities where, the candidates are expressing what we could say are anti-democratic leanings.
Right. The idea that, we're going to take that there are efforts to, as we've talked about in here, affect the selection of these election administrators, which have heretofore been seen largely, and I don't want to be naive about this, but largely, administrative positions with pretty clear lane markers in terms of and a degree of buffering from partisan politics. That seems to be changing. And also, of course, the January 6th commission, committee has been getting, a lot more internal looks at what unfolded after the last national election. So all of that, I think, is feeding this discussion again. And, we're not going to overly dwell on that, but it does have manifestations in Texas. And it does seem to me to connect with the other big thing that's been more of a local angle story from the Texas perspective, but fueled by national coverage. Metaphors catch on in media coverage, but something that's really caught on is Greg Abbott as a weather vane. Now there's, that comes from the cover of the the new issue of Texas Monthly, which is their year-end bum steer issue, which they take the opportunity to poke fun at, absurd, often mordantly absurd things that have happened in the state, and they play it for laughs. And it's usually a multiple person effort with both some Texas Monthly staff writers, some contract writers. But they put Greg Abbott on the cover as the bum steer of the year, portrayed as, a weather vane with icicles hanging off of it. But this comes after, two national stories, one in the LA Times by Mark Barabak, who's been a guest on the podcast before, the other in an article in the New York Times by one of the New Texas correspondents, I think it was by David Goodman, in which this notion of Abbott as following whatever way the wind blows recurred in both of those stories. So all of a sudden you've got this notion that has, we've talked about in here, and there's certainly been a matter of discussion in internal politics of the state, that Greg Abbott is kind of very focused on re-election, and that his public positions and his policy preferences over time have changed according to that context.
Right.
So, we don't want to, we could deconstruct this to death as we were talking about this going into this. We already have once today.
Yeah.
And you can take the trope and, deconstruct it to the point of, people turning it off or it just not making any sense or you devolving into like no real point. But it does raise some interesting issues about how Abbott is governed.
Yeah.
How he's governed in terms of what the upcoming election and the political landscape. And it points to institutional factors, it points to political factors, it points to things that are in the political system and the political economy right now that the weather vane thing captures well in some ways, but not in others, right?
Yeah, I mean, just as an initial reaction, and the weather vane thing has a certain, it has a resonance because I think people are.
By the way, if you want to play a drinking game with today's podcast, I'd say weather vane's probably
weather vane's a good one.
Word if you're looking to knock off early.
Not endogenous, okay. So and the weather vane, trope as you put it is right. I mean, sometimes it's useful, and I think the thing about tropes and the thing about it in this case is that I think it lands well with people because what are you saying? Oh, this is a politician who's just kind of flopping around the wind. But it sort of just ignores, all kinds of layers of complexity around this. And even just, I think just some simple, gut checks.
Yeah.
In that, first and foremost, does the wind ever blow in the opposite direction for Abbott? Well, not really, right? Is it the case that, within his party, the wind is blowing in multiple directions? You say, well, not really. And so there's this, I think the way you put it earlier when we were talking about this the first time, it's like a weather vane in a wind tunnel, and that's the thing. So it's sort of useful, but it also, it really belies a lot of the complexity here, which is that it's not so much, or really just, let's say that's complexity or the nuance, which is that, we were talking about this earlier about the nature of the Republican coalition and the fact, and what strikes me about it is it's not so much that, he's, the weather has changed so much. It's just that, the ability to inflict let me say about this. We're going to kill this freaking metaphor. Again, already killing it, but the ability to, activate the weather vane. I don't know what the word is for activation of a weather vane, right? But the ability to have her wind blow through a weather vane, it just doesn't take much.
Yeah, makes it sound like a digital weather vane.
I know, but it just doesn't take much, right? And so the issue here is that, it's not as though most Republicans in the state who are the majority party, who Abbott is primarily catering to, which is not different than in any other state with any other partisan politicians. The thing is that there have always been a number of checks sort of on the most extreme elements of the party directing policy to basically their desired endpoints, which in often cases are pretty extreme for the state. That kind of seems to have sort of gone out the window. Now, that's not a change of weather vane, per se. What I was saying is there's overlapping coalitions in the Republican Party that probably almost certainly hold relatively similar attitudes. The difference now is that, when you go and say, well, does someone who votes basically solely on abortion, are they, pro-gun rights? Well, probably on average, they are pro-gun rights. Do they think that we should have permitless carry? Maybe not entirely. But the permitless carry sort of, Second Amendment absolutists seem to be driving the discussion now in a way. Same thing on abortion, right? The idea that we would ban abortion in the state was, it was conceived of as political suicide, I think, for many years.
And that was the hook of the Barabak piece, right?
And that's the hook of the Barabak piece, right?
Right. I mean, this column in the New York Times that Mark wrote, and there was a great, I love the journalistic sidelight of this.
LA Times.
or LA Times, yes. Which is that during the 2014 campaign, apparently, per Mark's column and per conversation with Mark, he wrote a story that characterized Greg Abbott as opposing abortion rights, and
except in the case of danger to the life of the mother,
right? And basically he got a correction from the, sort of a request / pressure for a correction from the campaign, which the Times ultimately printed, which said that, to wit, the now Governor Abbott supported abortion rights prior to 20 weeks for any reason. Now, I was thinking about this and going back to the context, that is, still when there were efforts to just edge the viability standard down a little bit. 20 weeks was a little before that at that point in time. But, the Mark's column, hinged on the fact that, they strong-armed a correction out of them in 2014. 7 years later, Governor Abbott seemed to be, perfectly willing to sign legislation that would, outlaw abortion should Roe v. Wade be overturned, the trigger bill, and this now infamous SB 8 with the 6-week ban, and sort of saying, and that became kind of the vehicle for the column to be about Governor Abbott being flexible in his positions, and I think on one end that's it's an utterly fair characterization. Yeah. There's a lot of distance between those two positions, and I think. The typical kind of candidate response, and I haven't seen any response to this. I think that column got a little less attention in Texas than I would have thought, frankly. But, people can go back and discover it. But, it also, sort of underlined the degree to which Abbott is willing to move. But also, as you were saying, within, some set of parameters, within a particular universe.
Yeah, and that's right. And then the idea that Abbott's actions are somehow happening, in a vacuum, not a wind tunnel, right, on its own. I think all you have to do is look to the Senate and say, and we talked about permitless carry earlier in the session, Patrick's first response to it was, well, we don't have the votes for that, until it turned out that he did, and then they found the votes, and then they went and they passed it.
Right.
And that was based on, a similar characterization that he had, portrayed, in previous legislative sessions around permitless carry or constitutional carry or whatever you want to call it. And so, clearly there's something going on here that's not just about, Abbott and Abbott's positioning and Abbott being, a weather vane to this. There's a change going on in the political landscape in the way that, we think about it. I've said this before, I'll say it real quick. I think one of the big factors just from an electoral standpoint is that, Republicans aren't going to win elections in this state at this point by 15 to 25 points. Yeah. And that was not a reflection of, of their advantage in the electorate. It was a reflection of a lot of things, a reflection of, lack of Democratic candidates, asymmetry in the organization and the resources of the two parties. There's a lot of stuff going on there. But if you think about, but generally speaking, Abbott and other Republicans, Rick Perry go back, they could get some support from Democrats. They could get a lot of support from independents, and even in some cases, Democrats just not voting was fine. I think those days are basically over at this point. As long as Democrats can at least put up a good candidate and some good campaigns, they're going to turn out. Their partisans. And so at this point, Abbott's universe of voters have changed. Over this time period. Now, is that him being a weather vane, or is that him saying, look, I don't win elections by getting 5% of the Democrats and, a majority of independents at this point. I win elections by turning out every Republican voter.
Yeah. And I think that, a piece of, the historical context here that does, I think, provide a little more subtlety than just saying, hey, look, this guy, all he does is panders. There's a broader question about, well, doesn't the system invite you to pander to some degree? And I think so the pandering piece has always been a little, but also, one of the things that I was, and obviously I was really struck by this Bear About column, but it's because of, it really invites a revisiting the trajectory of things, right? In many ways, Abbott came at kind of a watershed in terms of this discussion of, how much do you have to appeal to the center/center right as a Republican in a period of Republican dominance? And remember, in 2014, Republicans had been in charge for a decade, but the Perry governorship had actually seen the transition that really started what we're talking about, right? Which is, I think, there was a lot of attention paid when Rick Perry began in the mid to late 2000s after his first full term, after his first term and a half, where it became clear that the political economy in the state, the rise of more organized, more powerful right-wing and conservative interest groups, the continuing attenuation of the Democratic Party in the ways that you're talking about, the weakening of the Democratic Party interest group universe in which, the trial lawyers by this time had been decisively defeated or beat back by the tort reform forces and their allies in the business community. You were beginning to see more money pouring into oil and gas as a result of fracking.
Declining union membership and laws.
Right.
I mean,
And all those things were really converging in, a new kind of moment in which increasingly, and again, Perry was the person who really innovated this, there was less attention to appealing to the middle or even trying to be bipartisan.
Yeah.
I mean, people would use the word bipartisan in the late 2000s, but they didn't really, it was window dressing.
Yeah.
And it was pretty clear that the kind of appeals that statewide Democrats and increasingly legislative Democrats were making was less keyed to this, pragmatic Texas, golden age of Texas politics middle. And I think that is why, when we look at this now, you have to think about the context, and it goes back to, now we find ourselves with the usual suspects as we explain this, more polarized, more ideologically sorted parties, negative partisanship.
Yeah.
And I guess that's what makes me a little bit, and uncomfortable is even too strong a word.
Yeah.
We were talking about political theory this morning on our walk to get coffee.
Oh, God, don't tell people that.
I know. If you guys were in the studio, you see Josh, he's cringing a little bit, waiting to see what I'm going to say next. But there is a sense, and you kind of said this in a very concrete way when we started, but I mean, this guy, to me, fleshes it out a little bit. A real apt metaphor always obscures something.
Yeah.
Right? And in this, it's that kind of sense that, well, and I'm not making excuses for anybody, either the columnists or the governor, but there is a sense in which when people go, well, the governor, he's pandering to the Republicans, I'm like, and the most extreme elements of his party, I kind of want to shrug and say, well,
yeah,
what do you, do you expect something different? Now, to be fair, I would say that we've certainly expected something different. I think during the early days of the pandemic, we were, I think mildly or to guardedly critical of the response to COVID once it seemed to be driven by politics inside the Republican Party. And I would still stand by that critique.
Yeah, sure.
But I also think that, we shouldn't be shocked that in this environment where, as you say, there's no Democratic Party, or the Democratic Party is more viable and the state is more competitive overall, but there's still not much of a shot that the Democrats
level
can stand up to the Republicans in 2022 and trade blows on an even basis, right? That's just not going to happen. Nobody thinks that's going to happen, even if the Democrats did wind up drafting Beto O'Rourke, who's probably, the best they got to offer at this point.
Right.
So, this is going to happen.
Yeah, and I think thinking about the broad trajectory, I mean, you were bringing up the Perry years and thinking about, I started much more closer to the transition there, right? Yeah. And what I think about is sort of two things. Is one, I think, you can't discount the impact on Abbott of not coming up through the legislative process like Perry did. So, I mean, to the extent of like golden age of legislating, this idea of bipartisanship, whether it was true or not, or whether, the nostalgia really accurately reflects it, ultimately, Perry did come through the legislative process. And if you talk to people in the legislative process, there is kind of a sense that, Abbott doesn't really, I don't want to say care, but grasp, some of the constraints and the difficulties they face in that process. But also, over the time frame, the relationship between the big three is changed pretty dramatically, right? And so there's that also. And it's interesting watching the way that, I would say Abbott has really, you could say he's pandering, but also it's like he's really grown. I mean, we talked about this back during the transition, the idea that, Abbott's coming in, given the sort of the marker that Perry's laid down for how powerful a governor can be in Texas, even though that's kind of against the historical norm, the expectation was Abbott was going to try to fill those shoes. And really, he has in each consecutive sessions, save with I would say a little bit of a step back maybe in 2019 after the close elections, he has taken more and more of a role in each session in terms of sort of exerting himself. And the reason I bring up, his lack of legislative experience, and we just talk about this more, but when you're the Attorney General and you can see with Paxton, you get a lot of choice. You know, you get a lot of choice in picking your issues, in defining yourself for voters, and when you go out and, you know, drop a big lawsuit and press release and you know, in a way that in some ways, you know, you don't really get to do that as the governor. You know, a lot of the times you see like with COVID, you have to deal with this. So to some extent, is this, you know, it's sort of, I mean, to me, it's not the idea that all of a sudden, you know, we're talking about Greg Abbott as weather vane. I mean, there's something that keeps coming in my head, and I'll just put it out there. I remember when he was running for that position, and we had done a panel with a bunch of journalists. And I mean, you know, I think Abbott, again, as Attorney General, he, you know, gets to really control, you know, that was I wake up in the morning, I sue the Obama administration, you know, very good brand at that point. And I remember asking this question, like, well, how conservative is Abbott? And I remember, I think Gromer Jeffers was there. A couple of them was like, oh, he's conservative.
Yeah.
He's extremely conservative. Now, in those first couple sessions, you know, Patrick came in, he consolidated power. Ultimately, you know, Strauss was in charge of the House, and that was sort of a cooling mechanism. And you've seen these dynamics change over time, and it's hard not, I mean, from my perspective, it's hard not to look at like where we are now and I'd say, this guy's, you know, kind of running the show at this point. As much as we talk about Patrick and his control over the Senate, I mean, Abbott just showed I can keep you at the legislature in session for the entire year and tell you exactly what I want you to do.
Right.
It's hard to say that he's not the main player. And then going back to the institutional side of this again, you know, even if legislators are sort of unhappy with the direction, I'm not saying they are, he has such an infrastructure that he can lend them with his campaign account, with the research they do, that ultimately there's no reason for anybody to say boo to him in the party here because, you know, he's kind of he's expressed his power pretty clearly.
Right.
Here.
Well, and I think, you know, some of this has been, you know, and I don't know, you know, it would be an interesting question for some of the people there, but I mean, I think it would be interesting to know. I think you're not giving the Abbott team too much credit to consider this strategic. That, you know, as Patrick consolidated control of the Senate, you know, basically, you know, apologies to my friends in the Senate, you know, brought the Senate to heel. It made sense for the governor to have more, try to make more inroads in the House. Yeah. Through the things you're talking about. And I think, you know, I mean, there's a general sense out there, I think, in the Capitol community that, you know, a lot of House members do feel, you know, allegiant, beholden to, loyal to, wherever, you know, whatever the Venn diagram of some of these very different kinds of affects are to the governor.
Yeah.
And that, you know, the governor has done a good job of playing, you know, taking advantage of the House Senate, you know, the baked in House Senate dynamic that has gotten more baked in as the Senate has become perceived as, you know, the lieutenant governors.
Here we go, Gary, to drink. And this is why the weather vane thing is just, it's just, you know, you're like, well,
I actually stayed away from it for a few minutes.
No, for a few minutes, but this is where this idea.
For those of you that were looking forward to more drinking, I'm sorry.
But you just said the thing that I think is key, which is, you know, I mean, it's hard not to look at all this and say, look, this is strategic. I mean, look, you know, he's a strategic politician. He has a very strategic team around him. He has a lot of information at his disposal. Yeah. He has a lot of resources that he can deploy to his ends. And, you know, the idea that, you know, he's being thrown around by the winds within the Republican Party, it's like, you know, it's not a wind, it's a gale force. And if he weren't, then he wouldn't be in office. Yeah. I mean, just, you know, as a general, you know.
Yeah. And again, one of the, you know, I mean, and I think that's something that.
And the margin for error for that I think has gone smaller. I mean, we were talking about this morning too. I mean, I think, you know, to the extent that Donald Trump mobilized grievance as sort of a fuel for campaign, you know, especially in 2016, but even really throughout his presidency. I mean, what you kind of see now in some ways is that grievance can extend not just to Democrats, not just to institutions, but within the Republican Party towards other Republicans who are not seen as, you know, sufficiently, I always say conservative at this point, loyal to the cause as it is being defined in the moment.
Which is, look, very inflected by Donald Trump.
And that kind of brings us to the democracy piece of this.
It does, because, you know, I think that, you know, one of the factors that's hovering that we've touched on a couple times, but is, you know, and I think I said this last week, but I'm going to use the line again. The weakness of the Democratic Party has gone from being kind of an electoral condition to a structural feature of the system that is having structural consequences.
Yeah. Say more. Well, I mean, tease that out a little bit, because.
Well, I mean, you know, look, I mean, I
know what you mean.
It's one thing to say, well, the Democrats, they came close, they didn't, you know. But I mean, when, you know, they almost won, maybe next time, and they're growing and the state's getting competitive, and the state becoming competitive at the state level is true enough. But, you know, part of the long-term ineffectuality of the Democratic Party as a political force and as an institutional force is that it has skewed the perceptions. I mean, the Democrats have helped build the wind tunnel.
Yeah.
And they're not in it. And that's not blaming any individual Democrats, but to the extent that that is now an assumed part of the system is what I mean by it's now become a structural part of the system. And it, that's what enables us to talk again and again about the fact, and for people to raise the point again and again, that look, there are all these policies that got passed in the last year in Texas that there's no evidence that they enjoy majority support in the population at large, in the electorate at large. And yet, Republicans are pursuing these policies, Republican incumbents, with great gusto. And that's not we'll see. It may turn out to be a mistake, but I'll be surprised if the day after the election in November of 2022, everybody wakes up and goes, wow, the Republicans really dropped the ball with all that conservative legislation because the Democrats just made a bunch of gains.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody expects that.
Certainly not after redistricting.
And so redistricting and the other institutional piece, and that's another structural piece of it. That's exactly right. So, it's not, you're not affecting public discourse, or you're having not much of an effect on public discourse. You're certainly having no institutional leverage.
Yeah.
And that absence of institutional leverage has provided Republican incumbents and the Republican Party and the Republican coalition behind the party with more means of perpetuating their rule and increasing the probability that you're going to see more of these policies that people say, and again, going back and tying it to the pandemic, this is very practical. We're not just talking about the principle of democracy or a little erosion around the edges. We're talking about real policy consequences, when you have such a stilted discussion that is driven by that, by these kinds of forces.
I didn't think we'd get anywhere with this conversation, but I feel like maybe we are, because the way that I'm thinking about this is, the problem.
Oh, ye of little faith.
Well, yeah. The problem with, sort of the weather vane argument, again, one of the things here is you kind of say, well, no, look, Abbott was always super conservative, but there were constraints that were clearly placed on him, whether that was, a more moderate House that ended up sort of cooling things. He used that very strategically to his advantage through some debates, whether it was, basically his ability to affect the legislature, which he's definitely gotten better at with each, successive. As governors do, right?
Or they don't last.
And, he's consolidated his power in the governorship, which takes time in Texas for a lot of, institutional factors. And so really, in some ways, it's not so much, I guess what I'm thinking is it's not so much that he's a weather vane. It's that, essentially the constraints that didn't allow him to sort of, operate within sort of a full strategic, within the full strategic space available to him. They're gone. And so, he's not worried about independent voters leaving him because they left. He's not worried about, the fact that he's not going to get some passive Democratic support because it's gone. Right. And so all these things that were kind of, he's not worried about Democrats making, big inroads because they haven't. And also because now that we've done redistricting, it reinforces all this stuff, both for him, but also for all the other actors around him in terms of the fact that, now, you were running in a district that was, 60% Trump and now it's 78% Trump. Right. That just changes the calculations.
Yeah, and and I don't want to leave the impression that this is all. It's all over. We just saw in the past week the Court of Appeals, push back on Attorney General Paxton's desire to get directly involved in election enforcement without being invited.
Yep.
Which I think, frankly, probably surprised me that they went in that direction.
Given recent decisions, it would seem so. But the thing is, to go back to this discussion about Texas and Abbott and democracy and all that, I think, the voting stuff is particularly interesting because to the extent that, Abbott seemingly feels no constraints, on his actions, and Republicans, around him seem to at least tacitly or actively, engage in that, that's where I think, the other discussion this week was get around democracy was, are Democrats going to figure out a way to get Manchin to come along on this voting stuff? Because it seemed, that's a whole other thing. But it's seeming increasingly dire for Democrats. I think part of the reason, honestly, is Texas. There's a lot of states that are doing this, or a lot of battleground states that are doing this. But if a state is big, is urban, is diverse as Texas, can basically I'll just say, willfully engage in discrimination, which it is in terms of if you just look at the composition of the electoral districts that have been created in the race in a state that
There's some senators that would be very offended by that language.
Well, let's have a conversation. Invite them to the podcast. I just, explain how this works. So, I think that people are looking at Texas and thinking, okay, well, what's next is probably going to come out of Texas. And as of right now, when you look at Abbott, who seems to be completely unconstrained, I think that probably scares a lot of Democrats, both, I think, in Texas, but even at the national level at this point.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think that, I understand why people are alarmed. I think, there's the whole piece out there about the coordinated efforts. Mm-hmm. You mentioned the election officials, about what this looks like as an ensemble of things and,
right.
How worried we should be. And, I think there is reason to worry, but I would also, but I think that, we're going to learn a lot about that. As you say, Texas is going to be important in this, and we're going to learn a lot about how that all ultimately looks next year. Next year, I was, I guess we ended the podcast this way last time, so I won't go back to the, you thought this year was bad.
Yeah.
But it's going to be a very interesting year next year. And we will be back with the podcast. I don't know exactly when. Look for us probably second week of January, if I had to guess right now. I don't know what the calendar looks like, so what the days of the week fall back. But thanks for all the support, both on the ground and when we were doing this virtually from the audio crew in the Liberal Arts Development Studio. They're the best here at the University of Texas. Thanks to Josh for spending so much time on this. Thanks to you for listening, and we will be back next year. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.